I think it's really interesting. You see this, how this reverential stuff comes about when the seven sons of Siva tried to cast out a evil spirit. And then in verse 15, the evil spirit answers and says, I recognize Jesus and I know about Paul, but who are you? Who are you? And so what we see there is the evil spirit actually has a reverence for Jesus. The spirit, we'll use pronoun he knows who Jesus is, right? He definitely is in fear of Jesus. He says, I recognize Jesus. And then he says this, I know about Paul. I find that interesting because is this where we see how evil spirits are kind of locational in some ways? It definitely tells you that an evil spirit doesn't know everything. They have no foreknowledge. They have no omnipotence to know all things, because he says, I know of Paul. He doesn't say, I know Paul or I met Paul. He just says, I know of Paul. So I find that a really interesting way that they state this in the Greek. Welcome, everyone, to the Salty Pastor Podcast. I'm Douglas Peak, and I'm your humble host. That's right, I'm your humble host. What does that mean? Well, in Philippians, Paul tells us not to look out for our own interests, but to look out for the interests of others. In the New American Standard, it says, do not consider your own interests, but consider the interests of others as more important than yourself. So the reason I'm doing this and the reason I'm podcasting is because I think you're important. And I think you're more important than my own time. I really do. I think that your journey of faith is the most important thing. That's what I am committed to. And that's why the Salty Pastor Podcast is all about coaching you up in your faith. It's about helping you grow deeper. It's hoping that you grow stronger, more confident. You can navigate this thing called life because you learn a few basic things that make maturity possible. Number one, what you believe and why you believe it. It's how to think critically and make good decisions. And as Paul tells us in Ephesians chapter 4, around verse 15 or 16, and that is that we're to grow up into all aspects in him to a mature person so that we are no longer tossed here and there by every wind of teaching or ideology or perspective. When that happens, man, you know who you are, you know why you're here, and you know where you're going. And let me tell you something. That's the way life was meant to be lived. So everything we do here on the Salty Pastor Podcast is done in humility, basically meaning that we want your faith to be the most important thing that we're investing in. And so we're now in a series called The 7 Deadly Emotions. And just to bring you up to speed, if you're brand new and you haven't heard, and that is that back in about the 4th century BC, not quite 400 years before Christ was born, Aristotle, the philosopher, lived, and he postulated 7 virtues: trust, compassion, courage, justice, wisdom, temperance, and hope. And so this really became a part of kind of early Christianity, because the Aristotelian perspective on the world really fit well with the philosophical side of Christianity, because you have to remember that Christianity was based on knowing Jesus, and knowing Jesus was a propositional truth and who he was, what he did on the cross, and he rose from the dead. And so that it was a propositional truth acceptance faith. That's why it wasn't technically a religion when it started at all, because it wasn't about ceremonies. It wasn't about behavioral activities, language, dietary habits, any of those types of things that you had to do prior to this to appease the gods or your God. It was about knowing a person. Radical shift. That, of course, is time for another podcast. But today I just want you to know that this Aristotelian ethic and perspective fit really, really well. And so it's always had kind of an influence at some level. And then in probably the 3rd century AD, this is about 280 years after Christ was born, was a scholar, theologian, an early church father by the name of Evagrius Ponticus, and he basically postulated the 7 deadly sins. And of course we know about that. And then later on, you know, about Dante's Inferno, and all these people talk about hell and deadly sins and all this kind of stuff. It kind of took a life on its own, but there's not really 7 deadly sins per se listed in the Bible. But Evagrius, he listed them out. So what we thought would be really good, because we live in the day of the psychological man, people don't think in terms of virtues and sins anymore. They think in terms of emotions. And the predominant way that people think today is not a rational logic, but with an emotional logic. And so I decided to kind of package these a little bit different and call them the 7 deadly emotions. What are they and what makes them deadly to your life? And they are anger, fear, anxiety, despair or sadness, boredom, you know, which is kind of a slothfulness, guilt and shame, envy, emptiness, lust. Emptiness is kind of one of the drivers of lust, I would say, but we'll get into that later. Today, what we're going to do is focus on the second one. Last week was anger. This week is fear and anxiety. So we're going to kind of dig into that. And the first thing we want to do is we want to build the biblical teaching on these things so that we have a real solid biblical perspective, okay? And so when you look up the word fear in the Hebrew, and then you look up the word fear in the New Testament, you find a lot. I mean, there's almost 400 references. I mean, that's a lot. You know, you think there's 66 books. So you're thinking every single book has multiple references to fear and anxiety. In the Old Testament, there are 10 Hebrew nouns that are referencing fear, and there's 8 verbs. And these nouns and verbs, so 18 different words, are regularly translated as fear or to be afraid. They kind of come from a root word, which is kind of, I'm not good at Hebrew. I don't pronounce it very well, but it's basically YR, all right? The noun form would be yirah. And so it could be more and the verb is kind of like yare. So these are the different forms of it. And it's just really interesting that you'd have 18 different ways in which to talk about to fear, to be afraid, or just to have fear in general. But there's also another flavor that it has in the Old Testament that we'll get to in a moment. The New Testament employs a different word because, of course, it's Greek, so it uses the word phobos or phobeo, and this is almost exclusively used as noun and verb, respectively. So phobos is the noun form and phobeo is the verb form, and they are consistently used by what is known as the Septuagint. If you're not familiar with the Septuagint was a Greek translation of the Old Testament. And so the vast majority of people studied, particularly at this period of time in Rome, the Old Testament, not in the original Hebrew, but in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and that was called the Septuagint. A lot of our modern day translations of the Old Testament come directly from the Septuagint. And if you have a study Bible, if you have a Bible that kind of tells you where there's some discrepancy or disagreement over how to interpret a specific word or phrase, or what they'll do is they'll annotate at the bottom or footnote it. And what they'll do is you'll see the Roman numerals LXX. And so that is a traditional reference to the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Now, what is important to note is that all of these words are basically covering a spectrum, right? If you go from, the right, you draw a line all the way to the left or vice versa across a page, then what you do is you can set things on there across this spectrum. On one end, maybe the left side, you would say, this is a mild uneasiness. And then on the far right, you would write stark terror, where you can't move. You're just so scared. And so all of these words basically cover this spectrum. And there are two things that you have to consider based on these words and how they're used that determine where you are at on the fear spectrum, from mild uneasiness to stark terror. And that's what's interesting about fear, is that number one is, in the Bible, the object of what you fear must be taken into account. Okay, now some things might make you uneasy, like you're walking down the street and there's a little chihuahua or a teacup terrier that is barking at you. And you're like, okay, that dog is unhappy. I am mildly uneasy about this. And then on the other side, you have a mountain lion that's loose or something like that, or a wild bear that's coming at you in an aggressive way. You might have stark terror about that. And so that basically means the object of what it is that's causing the fear is important. And this is a big deal because what you can say is that there are certain things that create more fear and there are certain things that create less fear. In the Old Testament, the presence of God, or God showing up, often created stark terror for people because they realized that their sins have not been atoned for. That's the whole point of the Old Testament Jewish sacrifices. I mean, the entire culture, the entire lifestyle revolved around regularly atoning for your sins, right? In some form of or another, for all your mistakes, for all your flaws, for all your failures. So they were raised on the stories of Moses, for instance. And one of the most interesting stories in the Old Testament is when Moses was up on Mount Zion wanting to get the 10 Commandments, and from God, he was getting the codified law, and he asks God if he can see him, because all he does is hear. And the Lord basically says to him, well, no, because if I let you see me, you'll cease to exist. He says, so I'll tell you what, hide yourself in the cleft of a rock, I'll cover you, and then I'll walk by. And after I walk by, you can like uncover your eyes and I'll uncover you, and you can look at the train of my glory. In other words, the wake of what I leave behind. Like, for instance, you're out on a lake and a boat goes by. You don't see the boat because it's out of your field of vision, but you see the wake that it left and you go, oh, there was a boat here. So that's kind of what he's talking about. And so it's really quite interesting. And so this concept of stark terror and the way the Old Testament used the word fear was pretty prominent, because to see God or to have God in your presence was devastating. Another place that this is evident is in Isaiah chapter 6, where Isaiah says he was caught up and brought into the throne room of God. And the first words out of his mouth are stark terror. It's woe is me, because I'm a man of unclean lips. So he's saying, I know a lot about God. And what I know is that if I'm in his presence, I'm imperfect and I'm going to cease to exist. So that was stark terror on his part. Oftentimes we see people who see angels, even in the New Testament, when Mary saw an angel, the first thing out of an angel's mouth is what? Fear not. So the presence of the Lord, particularly in the Jewish culture, prompted a tremendous amount of fear. So the object of the fear is a big deal when you're evaluating your own fear. The other aspect of fear, the second component, is the circumstance surrounding the experience. Okay? Now, the circumstance in what's happening outside of you, not just the object, but the circumstance, also creates a lot of fear. And so I thought that was really kind of interesting, something that we'll analyze a little bit more later on. Third, I think the other thing, though, that we have to bring into that is commonly misunderstood, and the reason why is because it's the same word, and if you don't really read the context, you can kind of misunderstand. And the biggest debate among scholars today is about this third option and how it fits with the spectrum option of mild uneasiness to stark terror. Because anywhere on that spectrum, you're dealing with basically the same type of fear. But in this new area, or this third area, you're not really, dealing with the same thing. at least on the surface, it doesn't seem like the same thing, or is it? So that's what we hope to answer, and that is this. The meaning that becomes more and more dominant in the Bible is that fear represents a reverential awe or a worshipful respect. So it's like a deep, abiding respect for a reverential awe for not only the object that is causing fear in you, but the circumstance in which it is happening. So the big debate out there is, well, is this type of fear, this worshipful respect, this reverential awe, the same type of fear that creates stark terror? And if they're different, how are they different? If they're the same, how are they same? And how does that impact you in understanding whether your fear is deadly or healthy? Well, that's a great question, isn't it? Well, let's jump into the Bible. There's all different kinds of passages, like I said before, that deal with the issue of fear. I wanted to go to one that you may not have heard before, and I'm going to read it for you and kind of, dig into it a little bit. It's Acts chapter 19, and what it is it's about Paul. He goes to Ephesus, okay? And this is right after he starts the third missionary journey, and a bunch of stuff happens at Ephesus when he shows up there during this third missionary journey. And you can read verses 1 through 10 and see how long he was there and what happened and where this was going. And I just want to pick up with verse 11. And this is what it says. Now, God was performing extraordinary miracles by the hands of Paul, so that handkerchiefs or aprons were even carried from his body to the sick, and the diseases left them, and the evil spirits went out. But also, some of the Jewish exorcists who went from place to place attempted to name over those who had the evil spirits the name of the Lord Jesus, saying, I adjure you by Jesus whom Paul preaches. And the 7 sons of Sceva, a Jewish chief priest, were doing this. Now, here's what's important, is that everybody agreed that there were evil spirits of people. People would often pray for evil spirits to come in and inhabit them, to give them strength or power over an enemy or whatever the case. And so every belief system, paganism, even in kind of the Roman mythology, and now in Christianity, there was this concept of dealing with these evil spirits, okay? And what's interesting is that there were Jewish exorcists, meaning people who went and cast out evil spirits from people, who were the 7 sons of a Jewish chief priest. Now, they were not followers of Christ. They did not believe in the propositional truth of Jesus, who he claimed to be, that he was a Messiah, that he died on the cross, rose from the dead, that he was God incarnate. They didn't believe that. What they did, though, is they saw the power in that name that Paul was exhibiting. And so this is an interesting thing about where our power comes from and in this world. But basically what happens is they tried to do it as well, because they didn't understand that Paul had a personal relationship with Jesus, with God, and that's where his power came from, is through faith. What they thought is this was a magical trick, that, or some type of order of the universe that would require these spirits to obey. But listen to what happens. Now, an evil spirit, when the 7 sons of Sceva did this, verse 15, answered and said to them, I recognize Jesus, and I know about Paul, but who are you? And the man in whom was the evil spirit leaped on them and subdued all of them, meaning he beat them up, and he overpowered them so that they fled out of that house naked and wounded. So he basically overpowers them, he strips them, he beats them, they then run away. Now this became known to all, both Jews and Greeks who lived in Ephesus, and fear fell upon them all, and the name of the Lord Jesus was being magnified. So my question is, well, what kind of fear fell on them? Was it just basically, oh, I'm afraid that I'm going to get in trouble or something bad is going to happen to me? Or was it a reverential awe at the overwhelming power of Jesus Christ? And so it's really kind of interesting. Is it both? How are they fit together? And he goes on to say, now many also of those who had believed, now these are people who believed in Jesus Christ and were deemed by him, kept coming, confessing and disclosing their practices. What practices were they disclosing? Well, they're appealing to these evil spirits, their demonic practices and so forth. And many of those who practiced magic brought their books together and began burning them in the sight of all. And they counted up the price of these books and found it to be 50,000 pieces of silver. So that's a lot of money. So the word of the Lord was growing mightily, and it was prevailing. And I love how they say that. It wasn't just growing, but prevailing. What was it prevailing over? All of these alternative ideologies that people had used for centuries to bring about a better outcome in their life. They weren't working, and they were impressed by the power of Paul that came to him through his faith in Jesus Christ. You see that in verse 11 and 12, where it says people would try to take handkerchiefs from him to go and cast out spirits. And that's what's interesting, evil spirits. Now, evil spirits, I think it's important to understand, basically covers a really wide gamut of things. We won't get into that right now due to time, but that's time for another podcast. Well, I'll tell you, no shortage of things to talk about on the Salty Pastor, that's for sure. But basically, I want to dig into this because there's some general things that I want you to see. There's various types of fear that are being represented at different levels. You see the trembling fear, when the seven sons of Siva are beat up and take away, boy, there's a fear there that, man, I'm scared to death about what's going on. You know, that this spirit of this evil man overpowered seven people and then 7 men and stripped them naked and beat them up. Man, that's crazy. And then on the other hand of it, but Paul is in kind of the opposite of this, and he's having victory, and more people are casting out their evil practices, and they're confessing them. They're turning to Jesus Christ in faith. And what's happening is that the word of God, right? The word of the Lord, the word of Jesus was growing and prevailing in a mighty way. And so what was it prevailing over? Well, it was prevailing over the fear. The fear of what? Believing the wrong thing. The fear of failing about the point and purpose of this life. The fear that the evil spirits might have power over them in ways they didn't know. So there's all different kinds of fear on this spectrum, while also including a different type of fear, and that is reverence and of God. And it's a worshipful awe of the Lord. And so the word of the Lord prevailed in many, many ways. So I think it's really interesting. You see this, how this reverential stuff comes about when the 7 sons of Siva tried to cast out a evil spirit. And then in verse 15, the evil spirit answers and says, I recognize Jesus and I know about Paul, but who are you? Who are you? And so what we see there is the evil spirit actually has a reverence for Jesus. The spirit, we'll use pronoun he knows who Jesus is, right? He definitely is in fear of Jesus. He says, I recognize Jesus. And then he says this, I know about Paul. I find that interesting because is this where we see how evil spirits are kind of locational in some ways? It definitely tells you that an evil spirit doesn't know everything. They have no foreknowledge. They have no omnipotence to know all things, because he says, I know of Paul. He doesn't say, I know Paul or I met Paul. He just says, I know of Paul. So I find that a really interesting way that they state this in the Greek. So, but let's dig in and try to take these different types of fear and everything, and let's try to break it down in a practical way in order for us to understand when is fear healthy, when is fear not healthy, and how fear can become deadly, and exactly what does it end up killing. So let's dig into this different types of fear and try to see healthy fear and unhealthy fear, fear that is beneficial and fear that is deadly. Now, first and foremost, we know, and psychological research teaches this, scripture even teaches this, and that is at some level, fear can protect you. It can protect you just in every day. You get a sense of fear that you're in a dangerous situation, and that's a great warning sign. Maybe an intuitive sense that you need to escape or get away. If you're in the presence, like I said, of a rabid bear that's charging you, good idea to get out of that situation. Or maybe knowing something bad is about to happen. Okay, let's avoid it. So fear can protect you. It is a psychological benefit in that case. But fear can also terrify you as well. It can, you're in a situation where you have a charging elephant at you, and they say that the most important thing when an elephant charges at you is to not run, because then the bull elephant will just trample you. Is that you just stand still and you stand your ground, and that elephant will come right up to you, and then it'll stop, and then it'll back up. And so that could be a frightening thing to do. But unfortunately, when you're terrified by fear, sometimes you do just the wrong thing. You just get up and run, and that's not always a good thing. So fear can protect you, but it can also, if you're terrified, cause you to do the wrong thing. Fear can create safety and security. Basically, people who work with things like electricians, for instance. Some electricians, they adopt habits like, well, the first thing I do is I always turn the power off before I work on anything, right? Well, what does that do? It creates security and safety. Maybe somebody who is involved in developing partnerships. They've been burned in a few partnerships. So up front, they operate out of, well, I don't want to let this thing go bad again. So here's how I protect myself up front. Like I was listening to a landlord talk about how you write a lease contract and what you put in it and how it's worded and stuff, because he says, in the past, I was burned so many times. What I'm trying to do is protect myself because I'm afraid of being burned again. So in one level, you could say, well, some fear can create security and safety. But on the other side of that same coin, some fear can create powerful defense mechanisms that destroy your life. For instance, what if you're somebody who goes through a divorce, and so you're hurt so badly, you might say, well, I'm never going to trust anybody ever again. And you have all these defenses, right? And you always see the negative in people. Well, that doesn't really help you out. And what it does is it kind of kills. Fear could be deadly. Any future potential friendships, partnerships, or even romantic relationships, because your defense mechanisms are so overdeveloped and hypersensitive. So the next thing I think it'd be really important to kind of dig into is, okay, if that's the case, how do I know, or how would I know if I'm dealing with fear? Well, if it's on the spectrum and it's stark fear, I'm terrified, well, you're afraid. But what if it's way down on the other end of the spectrum? How do you know you're dealing with fear, and how do you know it's actually influenced you? So here's some questions you might try to ask yourself. Number one, how much do you think about what could go wrong? Do you tend to list out what could go wrong more than what could go right? Is your pros column very short and your cons column super long? And so the thing about it is that, well, on occasion, maybe that's realistic if you're doing a crazy deal. But do you tend to, over time, in all new situations, always minimize the pros and overemphasize and lengthen the cons? And so that's a good question. How much do you think about what could go wrong when you're facing anything new? Another thing is this. Another way to see how fear can influence your life and cause, the death of something is this. How often do you want to do something, but you end up not doing? Now, I'm not saying you want to go do something like, well, I want to go buy a car. Oh, I don't have the money to do that, so I can't. But it's more things like, you know what, I should study more, or I should put more effort into this. You know, I should call that person and go hang out with them. Oh, I should, go get a new job, or I could do this, I could make plans with people this weekend and go do stuff. I should, I would like, any of those types of things in your life in that regard. And then you end up not doing it. So if there's things that you want to do, you would like to do, areas you'd like to grow, new avenues you'd like to pursue, obstacles overcome, but you never do them. Well, the reason why is because there's some fear in there in some form or another. Oftentimes what people don't understand is that fear kills because of what economists call lost opportunity cost. And an opportunity cost to fear works like this, is that if it stops me from doing something, so I'll stay in security because I'm afraid at some level that I'm not maybe even aware of, and so I don't try, then what ends up happening is you miss out on the opportunity, the benefit, the prosperity of doing the thing that you wanted to do. So I think a perfect example of this is procrastination. That is, some people in very unique areas procrastinate because they're creative and it just hasn't gelled quite yet. Well, that makes sense. You're letting it cook until it can, come together properly. But vast majority of procrastination is we avoid doing stuff we know we should be doing. And not bad stuff, but good stuff. Like, we know we should get our chores done. We know we should reach out to these people. We know we should be more responsible. We know that we should study. We know that we should complete a project. We know, but we don't do those things. So that's an opportunity cost. What we do is we don't reap or experience the benefit of that thing if we would have gone ahead and done it. So procrastination is linked to fear somehow. I'd really like to dig into that someday and analyze that, but not today. I think we need to finally talk about how lost opportunity cost, in my opinion, is the entire theme of the book of Jonah. You remember Jonah? He's supposed to be a prophet. God says, I want you to go to Nineveh. He says no. He runs the other direction because he's afraid of the Ninevites. And then he gets on a ship, and then those people are afraid, and then they throw him overboard, and he's swallowed by a fish for 3 days. And then he's vomited up on a beach. And then finally he goes. It's just interesting how the lost opportunity cost is so significant in Jonah's life simply because he's afraid. He does the opposite. And so just think of the opportunity that he would have had if he would have simply done in the first place what God had asked him to do. And so, but he lost all of that opportunity and blessing. So anyway, the whole book of Jonah in a way is a lesson in opportunity cost. In other words, it costs a lot to not do the best thing first. So that's what that whole book is about, in my opinion. So finally, today, based on these biblical principles and what we studied in Acts 19, how do you know fear is killing something? Well, first of all, fear can kill your opportunity blessing by costing you something. Fear can kill any and all peace in your life. Fear kills your self-confidence. Fear, I think it kills good judgment. Fear kills potential blessing that comes from God. Fear can kill a lot of things. And I think anxiety is a part of fear. So I think this is a great place for us to stop. On Thursday, we'll get into a lot more practical stuff and application on fear. So without further ado, this is Salty Pastor signing off. Thank you for being with me today. Go over to our website, look up the Salty Pastor on YouTube, like and subscribe. You could go to the Salty Pastor on the internet, our website, and donate, because that's going to help this ministry move forward. It's completely on its own now, standing on its own 2 feet, so to speak. And so we appreciate all of you who support this ministry and who are benefiting from the Salty Pastor. Because remember, we're going to take time to do this, not for my benefit, but because I believe it can help you grow in your faith. And that's what's most important for me. So I want to sacrifice the energy, sacrifice the time for the benefit of your faith. I want to see your faith grow. I want to see your faith strengthen. And I want you to know who you are, why you're here on this planet, what you believe and why you believe it, and how to think critically. Because that's when you'll navigate life with courage and confidence like never before. And you walk in the full blessing of God. And that's what life was meant to do and be. So this is Salty Pastor signing off. Remember, always think for yourself.